Welcome, everyone, to the Atlantic Council Iraq Initiative's briefing discussion this morning on Iraq's post-election scenarios and what we're looking at in the weeks and months ahead in Iraq after the October 10th election. I want to thank all of the very distinguished guests that we have here, and Dr. Abbas Kadam, who's the director of the Iraq Initiative, who's also with us. And thank you to everyone who's listening to this as well. I wanted to say first, just very briefly, this is Iraq's fifth set of parliamentary elections, and they since the fall of Saddam Hussein, they elected lists of parliament members, and we're now going into this period, which is quite complex for people to understand, and hence the presence of all of our amazing experts will, I think, help us. A period of government formation, which is a bit different from ones in other countries. So without any further ado, I'll get started and introduce everyone. I'm just going to go across my screen as I see people here in no particular order. And the first person is Ambassador Douglas Sullivan, who is now president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and he's a former US ambassador to Iraq from 2016 to 2019, which was certainly a difficult period. And he was there also for the 2018 elections, so has a point of reference for that. Also with us is Dr. Abbas Kadam, who heads the Iraq Initiative and has a deep and long overview of Iraq and what its history and present look like and what they portend. Ambassador Rand Al-Rahim is the co-founder for a long time now and president of the Iraq Foundation, and she was the first ambassador to the US from Iraq, and is Iraqi and also American, and deeply knowledgeable about the region. And then next on my screen is Deputy Assistant Secretary for Iran and Iraq, Jennifer Gavito, who has a long Foreign Service career but has spent a great deal of it in the Middle East and knows Dubai and Syria and Lebanon, as well as having experience in North Africa as well. So I think we'll have a lot of perspective to give us. So I thought we might just start with giving everyone listening a sense of the importance of this election. And first of all, there's some discussion that it had a rather low turnout. You may or may not want to discuss the significance of that. But I think the most important thing is explaining a bit about what the big issues will be that will face this government going forward. Issues internationally, on the more world stage, issues regionally, and of course domestic issues, which are very important to every Iraqi citizen. So perhaps we could start with Ambassador Al-Rahim and have her thoughts on that, and then move around and hear others' ideas.
Thank you very much, Alyssa, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for this invitation. I'm very happy to be with you. Let's talk about the importance of the elections. I think the major critical issue about why these elections are important is that they come as a response, that they're early elections, they're held 6 months ahead of time, and they come in response and in the wake of massive protests that took place between October and December 2019, and actually continued to go on. But the sort of the majority of the protests and the most intense protests were during that 3-month period, and this was really unprecedented in Iraq, because although there had been demonstrations and protests, mostly about services and the delivery of services, these protests morphed into a demand for political reform, for accountability, for fighting corruption, for fighting the confessional system that the Iraqi government is usually based on. So they had more of a political message about the state, about how the state relates to the citizens, and about the social compact between state and people than any other demonstrations. And of course, as we know, unfortunately, the demonstrations were attacked by unknown gunmen, and over 600 demonstrators were killed, thousands were injured. So they turned pretty bloody, to the dismay of both the people in authority and the public. And the demonstrations and the protests garnered a lot of support from the silent majority. So these elections really come in response to a demand for political reform, for a new social compact. They're not just like any other demonstrations to elect representatives, but these elections are really about, are we going to have reform? Is Iraq going to be a better place for its people or not? And I think, and what is Iraq's position in the region? How is Iraq going to balance and navigate the competing claims on its allegiances in the region, on its sovereignty, and so on? So this is really why they are, in the view of many, and myself included, a sort of a moment of a possible change in Iraq, although not certain change.
Thank you. Any perhaps any other aspect that we should touch on? Ambassador Silliman, what are your thoughts?
I agree with everything that Renz has just said. I might add one point. One of the big issues in the demonstrations is the sense among many young Iraqis that they don't have a strong Iraqi identity. One of the slogans of the protests, Nurid al-Watan, seemed to me to be looking for an Iraq that they could be proud of, an Iraq that they could belong to. So I think that Iraqi identity was also an issue that was at the base of these elections and the way that people voted. I will point out that the median age in Iraq is 20 years old. So half the population is under the age of 20 and half over. And those young Iraqis have no knowledge of Saddam Hussein. They have no knowledge of what happened before 2003, but have a real sense of, if not the betrayal of democracy of their lives, they have not yet seen the benefits of democracy in their lives. And I think, as Ren said, this was an important aspect in the way that they will have voted.
Thank you so much. And Ms. Gavito, I'm sorry. What are your thoughts as you look at Iraq in the region, especially? What are the issues or thoughts about the significance of the election?
Sure. As we approach the December 31st transition from our combat operations, we're really focused on the enduring strategic long-term relationship with Iraq. And the reason for that is this administration really views Iraq as the center point of stability in the Middle East. And so, taking a lens, as you suggest, a more outward facing, as we look to regional initiatives, the potential for resolution of conflicts throughout the region, Baghdad, Iraq have such a critical role to play in that. So naturally, these elections really are an opportunity to solidify Iraq's own stability as a catalyst to greater stability throughout the region. So, couldn't footstop more the importance of this really for the decades to come.
And Dr. Kadam, if is there something else we should be thinking about looking at this sort of larger picture, and then I'll sum it up and take it to the next step.
Thank you, Elisa, and thank you to my co-panelists. I agree with everything they said, and if I may add something to this election in particular, as part of the demands of the protests that Ambassador Rahim mentioned, one of the demands was to change the legal framework of Iraqi politics, and a result of that came the current electoral law. And this is the first time Iraq holds an election under this current electoral law. And this law changed the districting, one of the major aspects of it, to make the province more than one district. In the past elections, the province was the whole province was a district. So that allowed for a rise of independence, actually, and also the change of the vote being for the candidate, not for the list or for the political bloc. And many parties did not cope with this change, and they ended up losing some of their previous electoral or legislative weight, while others have gained handsomely. And this is, I think, very important aspect of the results that we will unpack in a minute. But certainly, we have the biggest story of this election. First is the change in the legislative map, how many seats for each major actor. And then, of course, we are happy to talk about the turnout, which is it is fairly low turnout, but I probably have a different idea of what turnout might be. It is not a sign or a measure of legitimacy. It is important for creating a mandate and bringing a parliament that is representative of the Iraqi body politic. But so long as nobody was prevented from exercising their right to vote, we would consider the election fair and free. But certainly, higher turnout would have changed the not just the look of the elections, but also the map in the Council of Representatives. These are the things that I wanted to highlight.
Well, taking off from that really interesting sort of assembling all those thoughts, the various notions of the protest element, the desire for a change, the desire by young people for an Iraqi identity. Many young people seem caught between trying to figure out where does Iraq fit? Where do they as Iraqis fit in the world they see on their phones and TV and other means, and also the world they're experiencing every day. The difficulty of getting jobs was a huge factor in the protests, which I covered in great detail. But also, I think the notion that Iraq is comparatively, at least, very stable in the region. So it has a big part to play, and it's why it matters that it work its way through this transition. So I guess what the one question I have is, where does that protest emotion, which is intertwined with this desire for identity, go, given the, as you've just pointed out, a relatively low turnout? So a certain probably frustration we're feeling that either people weren't sure how to vote. That's probably less of a problem, I'm guessing, in Baghdad. I mean, we won't know for a while before we see all the electoral maps, but in large rural areas and other cities. But also, what can we expect in this period, and how long might it last before we know what a government will look like, whether it will be able to work with the region? So maybe we could start with Deputy Assistant Secretary Gavido, and sort of what you look at as you look ahead, how long it might take, and what the vulnerabilities are of a country in this kind of period of transition.
Yeah, thank you. it's hard to speculate at this point what that process might look like, especially because we're still waiting on final results to come in for IHEC's final assessment. And so at this point, we really are focused on the integrity of the process rather than kind of quick reactions to how this process may take place. We acknowledge and know that the government formation process may take some time. And we are prepared to work with the interim government and the government that is democratically chosen after that. But I would steer away from speculating too much on how this may unfold and leave that to the extent.
Right. No, I understand that. I was more thinking that is this then a period where everyone is kind of trying to work with what is in a sense an evolutionary process, because my memory is that my memory is that U.S. always takes the position of working with all sides, and most ambassadors do not sleep at all in this period because all the meetings seem to take place at night. But I guess that you're satisfied with the integrity of the election, or you're still watching all of the signs as they come in and withholding judgment for a while? Is that the current U.S. view?
That's right. I mean, we again are, barely 48 hours from the conclusion of this, and so we just have to be extraordinarily careful. This process, by all that we can tell, we did everything in our power to support the Iraqi government's efforts to hold free, fair, credible, and secure elections. We congratulate them on having done that in a way that unfolded without major security incidents. But the way that these next, weeks and months unfold, and the dynamics as far as, the fluidity of it, and I think you nail it. It certainly is a moment where I think the parties will be jostling to figure out what is in the realm of possible. We don't want to get in the way of that, but it's an extraordinarily critical moment.
I think you just made a really important point, and one that is maybe worth taking into account as we think about the 41%. And that is that previous elections have had considerable violence. I remember certainly 2005, and even after that, there was violence. There were areas, Anbar in that first election was barely represented at all. Very few people were able to vote. So taking that thought, do any of you feel that the 41%, although it's disappointing that it's not higher, is in a sense a good 41% because it came about in a way that was relatively peaceful and there weren't large, I do not know the answer to this. I'm not sure what the early reporting shows, that large swaths were not excluded. Perhaps Dr. Kadam, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mentioned earlier in what I said is that I'm not concerned about the turnout, whether it's low or high. I do agree that higher turnout gives a higher mandate for the next government and the parliament, more importantly. Also, it shows that people are engaged. It shows that there is the gap between the people and their political leadership is not great. So higher turnout is good for democracy and for the electoral process. But I disagree with what was being said after the elections in many places, that this delegitimizes or delegitimates the elections. It doesn't. My main concern on every election anywhere is that does everybody who is eligible to vote gets to vote without fear or intimidation or security problems? As long as the government and those people who are holding the election, the High Elections Commission, etc., are encouraging voters to vote, they are making every effort possible to make voting easy and accessible. And it is only up to the voter to decide to vote or not. then the process is legitimate. In the case of a democratizing country and a fledgling democracy like Iraq, 41% or 40% is not a bad turnout, in my opinion. It's less than what Iraq had in the past, but 40% is what we have. You know, the United States, which is a well-established democracy, in legislature or legislative elections and off year, sometimes it goes to 36, 35%, sometimes even below. Only when the president is on the ballot, you see higher, and there are cases when the president is on the ballot, it's less than 50% as well. So even if the vote, from my perspective, is 80% turnout, and a few people are not allowed to vote, that's less legitimate than a 41%, and everybody who wants to vote gets to exercise his right freely.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Ambassador Abdurrahman.
Yes, Abbas, I only partially agree with you. Even if 10% vote and nobody is debarred from voting or prevented from voting, and there is a fair and free vote, then all elections are legitimate, no matter what the percentage. It is not the issue of legitimacy. Ever since 2005, when Iraq had its first elections, the number of voters, the percentage of voters, has declined. In 2018, the number announced by the Independent Higher Electoral Commission, known helpfully as IHEC, announced 44%, and many people said, well, this is not really, it's not really 44%, it's less. What happened after the 2018 elections? We had the protests of 2019, and I think the low turnout in 2018 was, in a sense, a harbinger of the protests. It was a sort of a, you know, like a smoke signal. Now we have a turnout of possibly 44%. The EU has said 41%. And in Baghdad, the numbers are in the 30s. And what these numbers show, it's not a question of legitimacy, it's a question of trust in the system and trust in the politics and in the politicians. And this is really the major challenge that faces any government that comes next, if they care. And they should care, because they are likely to have renewed protests if they don't care. So really the signal is not legitimacy. It is, the signal is, we have no trust in this political system. We have no trust. We do not believe that the state respects any social compact with its citizens. And we do not believe that these elections will bring about change, and therefore we will not vote. And these are very dangerous indicators. And this is really what I want to say, Alyssa, that I am concerned about the turnout precisely because what it says about the relationship between the people and the state.
No, I obviously one of the questions is, will protests be renewed as both during the government formation and as a way of pressuring decisions, and what effect will that have, and will they be peaceful? I would like to get a sense and give our audience a sense, perhaps from Ambassador Suleiman, of how the region has responded to the election, both to some extent to its outcome, but its outcome is still very much in flux. But overall, to it holding an election. It's a region which has many kinds of elections. So, what are your thoughts?
Well, let me start, Alyssa, by saying that from sitting now 6,000 miles away in Washington, the 2021 elections look a lot to me like the 2018 elections. There was not widespread violence. The process seems to have gone mostly correct based on initial announcements by the EU and the UN. And that means that Iraq may be easing into a pattern where they can actually conduct better elections, or at least more technically correct elections than in the past. I'm afraid that I agree with Ambassador Al-Rahim, however, that the concern that I have about low turnout is that many Iraqis who voted in more than 70% in the first elections in 2005 are losing faith in the ability of democracy to improve their lives. And most Iraqis, I think, expect that the formation of government process that is now going to begin will end up again with an Iraqi government that includes all the major political blocs. And the purpose of that will be to divide the spoils among the major political parties and the political blocs, the exact thing that the protest movement was pushing back against. So I really have two questions, and I will ask them because I'm interested in the ideas from the other panelists as well. In 2018, Muqtada Sadr seemed very hard to try to avoid responsibility for governance, or at least public responsibility for governance. He spoke through spokespeople, he didn't conduct negotiations directly, and didn't want a part in the government per se. Will that be his attitude now when it appears that his party has won the largest number of seats? Or will he be willing to say that a Sadrist candidate can be prime minister and can be in charge of the government? A second question, and this for me is a longer term question about the health of Iraqi democracy. Will the political system produce a majority government, someone who can get a majority of seats in the parliament, or will they again produce what I guess the Israelis would call a government of national unity, where everybody's in the government? And in my mind, when everybody's in the government, no one can really support the government because there's no common program other than dividing the spoils of governance. So for me, those are difficult questions. And I think the answer to those two questions may tie back to your initial question, will there be protests or not? If young Iraqis see differences in the results of governance and government formation from this process, I think they're less likely to go back in the streets. If they don't see differences, I think you could see protests and increased dissatisfaction, unless, again, something actually changes in this process.
It would be great if one of you could, perhaps Dr. Kadam, perhaps Ambassador Al-Rahim, explain a little bit about who Muqtada al-Sadr is now, because I have watched him really since 2003, when he was in Najaf and quite antagonistic to Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, and to say the least. And he has gone through many, I don't know quite what to call it, sort of personality changes. He's left Iraq, he's been in Iran, his identity is somewhat hard to pin down. So as we look at this, I think your question, Ambassador Sullivan, is right to the point. How will he approach governance this time around? And I wonder if, would you like to start, Ambassador Al-Rahim? What are there early signals? Were there signals during the election that are important for internal stability in Iraq, since that is obviously, as Deputy Assistant Secretary Gavito said, is really important for the region as a whole?
Yes, I think Dr. Kadam should take the lead on this, because he is probably closer to, he may have met Muqtada Sadr, I have not. So I'm going to cede to Abbas, and then I'll add anything I have.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. Actually, I have not met Sayyid Muqtada Sadr. I have met many of his close associates who are friends of mine, and they are. He has some excellent politicians who are at the national stage in Iraq. But I agree with Alyssa in one important point that she just made, is that people are still stuck on the image of Muqtada Sadr from 2003, 2004, 2005, and as if time has not changed, as if the circumstances in Iraq have not changed, as if the experience in the politics of Iraq that happened to everybody involved in them didn't exist. So I think it would be fair to look at the image and the modus operandi of Sayyid Muqtada Sadr as of today. The movement has matured a lot politically. He proved that he is more resilient than even more traditional parties that have been there. He does command an important voting bloc and an important movement that is constant in its size, if not increasing. And the loyalty between him and his followers is unmatched in Iraq. And that's what accounts for his steady performance from one election to another. He did not just win the election this time. Last time in 2018, he was also the winner. He held the highest number of seats in the Iraqi Council of Representatives. He also, as I mentioned, even though that he is the central figure in the Sadrist movement, it is a very strong leader-fellow kind of relation between him, not and his constituency, but also his political staff and cadre. Everybody in parliament or in the government, in the executive, or in the organization of the movement take a far back seat to him, and so there is no personality that is out there in the Sadrist movement. Everybody emphasizes Muqtada Sadr and what he says and what his instructions are, but also getting close to the people who are working for him. He has some people who are politically savvy. They have excellent political skill, and the movement itself has a very good organizational system that mixes the political, the social, and the religious together to create this unique sense of loyalty. All that said, we have to be careful to see this result of the election as any guarantee for him to appoint a prime minister, or even to act like the largest bloc in the parliament, because 74 seats out of 329 seats is not enough to do anything in the parliament, especially if the Shia don't caucus with him. He needs 165 seats to get anything done in the parliament, including the appointment of a government. And let's remember that in 2014, Maliki held 95 seats with his state of the law and still could not have himself or someone very close to him as a prime minister. It takes more than this partial win to make facts on the ground. The only way for him to really get benefit from this is to get other Shia to be with him, or completely give or put the matters in the hands of the Kurds and the Sunnis, which means that he will be weak, even if he gets to appoint the prime minister. And to be honest with you, if I were advising Sayyid Muqtada Sadr, I would tell him not to take the prime minister job and stick with what he has done very well so far in the past.
Thank you. Was there anything you wanted to add, Ambassador Rahim?
Just a couple of things. First of all, I think Abbas is quite right. I mean, Muqtada Sadr has been reinventing himself over the years. And the Muqtada we see today is not the one we saw in 2003 or 2005 and 6 at the height of the sectarian wars and so on. And he's also mercurial. I mean, he really although I haven't resolved in my mind whether this changeability is part of astuteness or part of his own sort of flights of fancy. For example, he decided to withdraw from the elections in July, I believe. It was a sudden decision, came out of nowhere, and sometime in late August he decided to go back to the elections. So you have these sort of changes in him, but also he's a pragmatist, and he is able to strike deals, and he knows he has to strike deals. He's a pragmatist when it comes to dealing with the Kurds, with Iran, with the region, and he will be a pragmatist when it comes to striking deals with other factions, including other Shia factions, if he wants to continue to be the prominent voice in building the government. He can't do it on his own, as Abbas said. So he's able to do deals. He can do deals. He's not so doctrinal and ideological that he can't work with others. The one constant with Muqtada Sadr is that he has presented himself as an Iraqi nationalist. And whether that's true or not, how deeply that goes or not, he has successfully marketed himself as the nationalist politician in Iran in a way that other politicians have not been able to. They've either been tainted with by presumed relations with Iran or with the West or with the US and so on. He is the one who has said, no, I am an Iraqi nationalist, and people believe him. And I think part of the following that he has built around him is by that branding. Mm-hmm. So that is one branding that has stayed constant from 2003 till today.
Thank you. I think that's actually an important point as I reflect on the protests, which had a significant Sadrist element, as well as many sort of globally looking, very educated, more educated, I would say more liberal young people as well. There were both of those elements kind of sometimes at odds, but both very much present in criticizing corruption, particularly in the government. I'd like to turn to one aspect of the election that was striking to me and a bit surprising and complex, which was that there was a big drop in the support for Fatah, which is the sort of collection of political lists or groups and individuals who are affiliated with originally with some of the armed groups that had been supported by Iran, some more, some less. And they were quite surprised by that. They were very critical in the news this morning. The election wasn't legitimate. They felt as if they had been in some way slighted in the election, I think, or that it hadn't been fair. But I do think that links to some of the themes we're talking about, the protests and the sense of antagonism. But what does it say about the relationship with Iran? And I do think that as we go forward, Iran and the US, and since we're in the United States, we need to think about this, are at the beginning of a renewed effort to try to figure out how to talk to each other and what they want to say and whether they want to actually come to an agreement about sanctions, nuclear weapon development, et cetera. So what is that? What impact might it have to have a reduced involvement of these groups and also in the parliament? And is that actually in Iran's interest because they do not want to be antagonizing the US at the same time that they are trying to reach out? Or are we looking at a change that's just up from the bottom and people just didn't like them anymore? What is it? How should we be reading that? Maybe, would you like to start, Ambassador Suleiman?
But that's a tough question. I saw during the time that I was there in the final months that there was a growing concern about sort of Shia militias in general in a couple of places. First of all, there was concern that some of the Shia militias were very much tied to Iran and pursued an Iranian policy. And as we've talked about, I talked about earlier, there's a need for an Iraqi identity, and they also want to see their government fulfilling ideas that are Iraqi. I think that's part of the attraction, as Ambassador Rahim said, of Muqtada Sadr. The fact that he has always portrayed himself as an Iraqi, he has been very anti-US, and despite the fact that he travels to Iran for quite frequently, he is still quite critical of Iranian influence. So that's one element. But frankly, there's another element as well. A lot of Iraqis, particularly in the South, have seen the rise of the Hashd al-Shaabi as a shadow government in their villages, in their towns, in their neighborhoods. And I think that this may well be a protest vote against the what had been growing power of unelected, in some cases, criminal gangs, in other places, simply unelected political parties taking over some of the functions of governance, including even trying to get control of some of the economic levers that belong to the Iraqi government. So I think a combination of this, if you will, a mistrust that the Shia militias have an agenda that may not be entirely national and Iraqi. And it certainly is a reason that many minority groups, Kurds, Sunnis, and others have been very worried about the expansion of the Hashd al-Shaabi, the Popular Mobilization Forces presence across the country. So I think that probably has a good bit to do. I'm also interested in preliminary results in the significant drop in support for what were traditionally moderate Shia voices, Amar al-Hakim, former Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi. And again, I ask this as maybe for Dr. Kadam or Ambassador al-Rahim, is the success of Imtidad and other independents, people more linked to the demonstrations, did that take votes away from what had been previously seen as moderate Sunni voices in the government, although very much mainstream?
Dr. Kadam, any thoughts on that? It seems an important question.
Well, it's an important question. I believe that the rise of independence, I mean, you have a fixed number of seats, and when you see 35 or more, some people talk about 30, possibly 37 seats going to independents, they will have to be taken from somebody, and they ended up being taken from the parties that are closest in their message and in their image to the independents. I believe that Sayyid Ammar al-Hakim ran an independent, non-sectarian Iraqi nationalist campaign. He has been doing so for quite a long time. And that did not resonate with sectarian-based voters. So people voted for the new independent politicians because they already know what Sayyid Ammar al-Hakim and his group will how they will govern and what their politics. There is a general sentiment against the existing ruling parties, so he suffered that way. I don't see former Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi's loss as a surprise. Let's remember that Haider al-Abadi went and joined Ammar al-Hakim's Hakma movement as an individual. The group called Nasr that ran with him in 2018, it's all gone. They went to other parties, so he went as an individual. And Abadi's performance in 2018 was basically because he was the prime minister. Let's remember that in 2014, in a city of 6 million people at the time or more, Baghdad, he collected only 5,152 votes. That's a really dismal performance, and he went back to this. He doesn't represent any ideology or any political party image or identity, so that's why he didn't add much to Sayyid Ammar al-Hakim. That's the reason. But I think that independence made the difference, and also the low turnout made a difference. The Hashd we will talk about it. But I want to give Ambassador Rand or other co-panelists if they have anything to add to this question, which is important, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Abbas. I think the issue of the huge loss of Fatah coalition, which includes the PMFs, their huge loss in the elections, and what Iran is going to do or can do about it, and how that dynamic is going to work out, is perhaps a central question to where we go forward, how we go forward. Because I think that Iraq is still regarded by Iran as its backyard, and the loss or the potential loss, I can't say loss, potential loss of influence through the electoral loss of its supporters, proxies, whatever you want to call them, is going to be very crucial to Iran's next movements. And we really have to see how that's going to work out. I want to add one more thing about the loss of the PMFs electorally. They were accused by the protesters of being the major agents of violence and of killings during the protests. And that really cost them a lot, in addition to their political, economic attempt at sort of controlling areas. But the accusation that they were the major killers really cost them. But it's I hope we can get to this point, Alyssa, about, okay, what is that group going to do? What is the Fatah coalition going to do about this severe loss in seats? And what is Iran going to do? And how are they going to do it?
I wanted just to very quickly ask Ms. Gavito, if you could just remind us of the current, I believe the U.S. position on the Hashid was to the extent that they were acting outside government structures, that the U.S. certainly opposed that very strongly and defended against that. But I think that was the official U.S. position, was against the Hashid, not as a political entity necessarily, that's a separate matter, but the militias, that has long been the U.S. policy. They had to be in the
Sure.
army.
Yeah, I mean, we support the Iraqi government. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we support the Iraqi government's own position that the arms should be within the control of the state. And our efforts are very much aligned in that direction. So that's right. I think this gets, though, to Ren's point, at a much bigger question about Iran and how it is likely to respond to this. So I just, if it's okay, wanted to say a couple of things along those lines. First of all, as far as Fatah's, presumed electoral outcome, again, I wouldn't presume to speculate on individual electoral choices, but I do believe that what we have seen over the last couple of years is a desire on the part of Iraqis to hold their government accountable for providing services, for working towards conditions that allow their economy to thrive, to offer a brighter future to the youth. And these are all themes that have been mentioned throughout this. And so, to the extent that individuals assessed that those were not the strengths of the candidates that they were assessing, there could perhaps be conclusions drawn there. But as far as Iran's reaction to this, it's clearly something that we're watching very carefully. There was, Alyssa, I think you mentioned a minute ago, referenced their openness to coming back into the fold, or to discussions, and whether they would want to jeopardize that position. And just to be very clear, the ball is and has very much been in their court now for some time. They requested the pause in negotiations on the margins of their elections. They have continued to pause as they pulled their government together. We're willing to come back to the table, but I'd also note that a lot of their actions, not just in Iraq, but throughout the region and within Iran itself, tell a very different story about a regime that is not necessarily prepared to do what it needs to do in order to meet the commitments, of JCPOA specifically, but to take a more responsible approach to the region. And so I think that is one of the stories that we need to watch very carefully coming out of this. Iraq has demonstrated, and we certainly support its desires to make its own choices, to be a sovereign nation. And as you referenced, that is not necessarily what is in Iran's interests. And so we will, continue to support their efforts in that regard, and at the same time hold Iran accountable for its destabilizing activity. But I just, again, want to be really clear that my assessment of where we are with Iran right now is not so rosy. They are welcome to come back to the table. We would like to negotiate and are prepared to negotiate and talk in good faith as soon as they are ready. But their destabilizing activities have to stop.
Thank you. I just want to say we have a couple of questions, and certainly if people have questions in the audience, they should send them. There's a question here, which is about chances of a coalition between Sadr and other moderate Shia, including the Kurds, for a parliamentary majority. I think that was somewhat discussed, but perhaps that goes to the larger issue of how politicians can respond given the somewhat inflexible setup of each of the ministries and the way political appointments have been made over the last 20 years, so that parties tend to dominate in certain ministries. I know that's somewhat less so in some, but still the case. How can the independents, and to some extent Muqtada Sadr represents those, really create a coalition when there are also these assumptions about spoils that go very deep? And I guess that's really a question about the deeper corruption in Iraq, and whether any government is going to be able to form that isn't based on an assumption about dividing spoils. So perhaps I'd be interested in hearing Ambassador Suleiman, you say a bit about that corruption problem, because it has really stymied Iraq for a long time.
Thank you, Alyssa. The corruption problem is not only division of cabinet seats, but it is really also about appointment to government positions. And what you have now is an Iraqi bureaucracy in virtually every ministry, which is unable to effectively conduct the people's business because it requires unanimity among representatives of a number of sort of mid and lower senior level political party operatives that now populate most of the bureaucracy. So this is not only about getting cabinet seats, although that is potentially lucrative for the individuals who get them. It's about the ability to reward political supporters with longer term government sinecures in ministries. And the effect of that has been to stifle the ability of government to conduct its business and do things. I'll also note that the process after elections is not just one to choose a prime minister. This begins with choosing a speaker of the House of Representatives who must be a Sunni, then a president. The president will have to determine what the largest bloc is in the parliament. And we know, based on the 2010 president and pushing Iyad Alawi out of the way for Nouri al-Maliki as the largest bloc, that this is something that is negotiated after the results of the elections are actually put in place. So the first thing will be, with whom will Sadr choose to try to form that largest bloc, a majority of seats, as Dr. Khadr pointed out? Will he want to go with Nouri al-Maliki and the State of Law coalition, which won a significant amount of seats? Will he go with Mohammed Halbusi, the current speaker, and his surprisingly successful Sunni bloc? Will he want to go with the Kurdistan Democratic Party, which also won quite a few seats? Or will he choose to pull together a majority of Shia, which would then involve Fatah or potentially Imtidad or some of the independents? And I think this question is going to be the first one. How will that largest bloc that the president will have to recognize with the opportunity to form a government be formed? And once that is done, will that bloc be the government, or will there then be further negotiations to expand to parties who want to be a part of the spoil system? And what will Sadr's attitude be? Because I still think, given his 72 or 73 seats, he will still be in the driver's seat and will have to make the main choices about what the government will look like and what the government representation will be at the level of the cabinet.
Thank you very much. I know you have to go, Ms. Gavito, but maybe if you could just say very briefly the U.S. view on corruption right now, because I know that has been an ongoing concern, and how the U.S. is hoping to work with this, whatever government comes next on that, because that's always been an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And it continues to be an issue. As you know, whatever government comes, we plan to continue with the dialogue that we have had ongoing for the last several years. And that is, a shift, an evolution, I guess, as we end combat operations at the end of the year and transition to a new relationship. Issues like corruption, but also economic prosperity and investment and human rights. Those types of issues that we discuss with, frankly, all governments will be on the table, as they have been in the strategic dialogue this summer and other fora with the Iraqi government. It's a big issue for the Iraqi populace. They've made that clear. And again, it's part of a normal diplomatic dialogue to raise our concerns, and we'll continue to do so where appropriate.
Okay. Thank you. I guess we should close with, we have a few more minutes and a few people can stay a bit longer. And I hope they will. I think the one question is, as we look ahead here, is how heterogeneous will the government manage to be? Because as Iraq remains one of the most both ethnically and religiously complex landscapes in the Middle East, and that risk of civil strife is always, or has been, in the background since the U.S. invasion. Do you see that diminishing with each election, or do you see that remaining a theme that's going to be sort of unavoidable? Iraqis, of course, themselves will always say it never was an issue until the Americans came, but in any case, it is one now. And I'd be interested to hear perhaps from you, Ambassador Rahim.
Well, in every government that was formed in the past, there were several considerations. First of all, how do you distribute the cabinet positions and presidency, the speakership of the parliament, among the different ethno-religious groups? You have to work out some kind of balance, and it has not always been easy. The reason it takes months and months to put together a government is because of these necessary balances, and that the Kurds should be happy, not just the Kurds, but the KDP and the PUK should be happy, and the Sunnis in their various sort of iterations should be happy, and the Shia, and so on and so forth. So every cabinet, and every time there has been a new government formation, they have had to have these balances. We're not going to get away from that. We're not in a position, in a place where we can say, well, we can form a government without the Kurds, or even without the PUK. It doesn't work. So we are going to need to create, they're going to need to create those balances and divvy up the positions. Yeah.
And Ambassador Suleiman, and then I'm afraid we'll have to stop and say farewell for now, but perhaps come back to this issue, since I imagine we could hold this a couple of months from now and be talking about many of the same issues. Ambassador Suleiman, any final thoughts on that, those tensions that have underlain a lot of the last 20 years?
I think Ambassador Rahim is correct. For the past couple of government formations, political blocs have demanded the percentage of cabinet seats that is more or less equivalent with what they got in terms of popular vote. So as long as this is going to be a government of national unity with all of the major blocs as part of it, you will see the division of government, I imagine, along those lines, where the blocs that get more votes will claim the prime minister and the sovereign ministries, and those that get fewer votes will claim smaller ministries, and will defend that not only at the level of cabinet, but also appointments within the ministry itself. And I fear that if that is the case, you will see a perpetuation of government dysfunction. There will be no real pressure to reduce corruption in governance. And the efforts that the United States is undertaking, as Daska Vito pointed out, over the course of the past decade, will probably have little impact if the political system and the distribution of power is based on the division of spoils, not fulfilling the will of the voters.
The will of the voters, and also actual knowledge about individual areas, be that health or finance or whatever. Well, look, thank you all so much for coming and your really thoughtful ideas and comments. And I hope to get to speak to all of you again and continue to wrestle with this and how perhaps the US can be of the most help as well.
Thank you, Alyssa.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. Thank you to the Atlantic Council.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you.